Kumusta? Welcome to the J. Aruga Show, the first conservative podcast in the Philippines where we defend life, marriage, the family, and more importantly, the truth. And today we have a returning guest to the podcast. He's staff apologist in Catholic Answers. He's a debater, a speaker, author of many books, and in this episode, we'll talk about his new book, Confusion in the Kingdom: How Progressive Catholicism bring is bringing harm and scandal to the church. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome host of the Council of Trent, Trent Horn. Hey, Trent, how are you doing?
Hello, Jay. Thank you for having me on again.
Hey, we've been seeing you everywhere these days in the internet, whether it be a debate with Destiny at the Whatever podcast or in Alibet Stuckey's show. We even saw you at the Daily Wire at the Bench of the
Yes.
Road show
Yes.
a couple of times. Kudos to all these appearances. We always love when we see people in the Catholic sphere crossing over with the world outside our bubble.
Sure.
What's your most memorable so far from these appearances?
Well, it was certainly memorable to go on. I've been on the Whatever podcast twice. That's a very large podcast. And Destiny is an interesting person to debate. And I think we've had some good conversations. So it was neat to get to see the inner workings of that podcast as well.
Yeah, I love your abortion debate with Destiny. I love your strategy there where you don't necessarily want to destroy him or show that he's wrong, but you want to show the audience that if you take Destiny's position, it will lead to a lot of undesirable conclusions.
Right. And I think that's the best way to show someone is wrong, because many people would say, well, I don't care about abortion. Okay. Well, if you hold this view on abortion, these other things are going to follow from that you probably don't like very much. Hopefully you don't like.
Yeah. And you're very busy. Do you still have time to relax and exercise your comic book nerd side?
I try to fit that in for sure.
Yeah. Just one trivia. I'm not sure if you noticed this, that a lot of Catholics in comic books, they're portrayed as devils. So, yeah.
I guess
you have Nightcrawler, right?
Nightcrawler was the first. Yeah. Nightcrawler was the first one that I thought of. Yeah. Daredevil.
Yes, Daredevil.
Daredevil.
Matt Murdock. And
I think there is. Yeah, go ahead.
Even Hellboy is a Catholic. So,
well, I think Catholicism is identified with opposition to the devil. And so I don't even think it's necessarily malicious. It's just understood that they're both kind of ancient in that way.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the book, Confusion in the Kingdom. But before we go to the specific subjects in the book, I'd like to ask, why did you choose to write about liberal Catholics instead of the radical traditionalist Catholics? Because one could jump out of the barge of St. Peter from either side,
right?
Either from the left or the right. So what's with the left?
Well, I do plan in the near future to write a book on those on the right that have gone too far, that I call Catholic fundamentalism. So that is in the works, actually.
Okay.
But I'm focusing on this because I am really concerned. I've already addressed it many times on my own podcast of those on the left, Catholic left, especially when they downplay and minimize church teaching on sexuality or human life. I find that when I try to advocate for the unborn, for making abortion illegal, some of the fiercest opponents I deal with are liberal Catholics who say they're against abortion, but they also don't want abortion to be made illegal, which is a position I find to be very strange as a Catholic to hold. Or Catholics that will do everything except full out applaud sodomy and same-sex behavior, that they really confuse people on something that is a very pressing moral issue that calls into question the truth of our faith, because many people in our culture today will just say, oh, well, I'm not Catholic because I don't see anything wrong with LGBT. So why would I be Catholic? And so we have to have a firm position on the issue while having a loving pastoral outreach to the people in the midst of the issue.
And yes, so for the audience to be clear, the focus of your book is not the far left Catholics who openly reject church teachings, like the Joe Bidens of the world.
Yeah.
They're the people who you might think are affirming Catholics, but their words and actions are
Confusing.
vague.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
confusing.
Father James Martin would be a primary
Yep.
example of that. I cover him at the beginning of the book, and there are others. Father Richard Rohr. There
Mm,
are lay people who lay theologians that write for the National Catholic Reporter that really do
mm,
create a lot of confusion on these different
mm.
issues.
All right. And since you mentioned Father James Martin, let's go talk about
Sure.
him. He's the first person actually that comes to mind when
Yeah.
everyone says liberal Catholic. So,
Right.
yeah, what's the deal with Father James Martin? To those who don't know him, wh- what does he do? What
Yeah.
does he say?
Father Martin is a Jesuit priest who had
Mm,
previously been known 10 years ago. He was known more for his writings on spirituality. He had been a guest
mm,
star on the Stephen Colbert Report, because Colbert is Catholic.
mm,
However, after in the later 2010s, when he received an award from a group that dissents from the church's teaching on sexuality, New Ways Ministry, he received a bridge building award for a talk he gave on LGBT Catholics in the church. In doing
mm,
that, he took that speech and expanded it into a book on building bridges. And there's
mm,
nothing wrong with wanting to reach out to those who are in different states of sin in opposition to the church's teaching, whatever it may be. But Father Martin, over the past 6 or 7 years, has really built up a reputation of creating confusion by not outright saying homosexual conduct is moral or denying it's sinful,
mm,
but in trying to make those who do believe that feel more welcomed in the church without expressing a call to conversion. So
mm,
he will say it's fine for Catholics to celebrate Pride Month, for example, or to
mm,
fly the LGBT rainbow flag in solidarity with those who identify as LGBT. And Father
mm,
Martin will say, well, because when I fly the flag, the rainbow flag, it just means I think people who identify as LGBT have equal dignity with everyone, which
mm,
is true. Catholics believe that, but that's not what the flag means. The flag
mm,
means that same sex sexual conduct is morally good. That's what the flag
mm,
means.
mm,
And so Father Martin's inconsistent here because he would probably also say that Catholics should not fly the Confederate flag, the Confederate
mm,
battle flag, because it is associated with the evil of slavery, even if not everyone who flies the flag is doing so to promote the evil of slavery.
yeah.
Father Martin should have the same position on the rainbow flag to say, just because not everyone uses it to support the evil of sodomy, the fact that many people do use it in that way shows it's a symbol that's unfit for Catholics. Yet he won't do that. He treats LGBT issues, issues of sexual morality, different
Mm,
than other issues, other moral issues.
mm. For the sake of the audience, the church is clear on her teachings
Yes.
on homosexuality.
Yeah,
The
paragraph 2357 in the
mm,
Catechism makes it very clear. It
mm,
says that these acts are intrinsically disordered,
mm,
though I believe Father Martin would very much like the Catechism to change its language on
mm,
that. But even if it did
mm,
change its language, it doesn't change the fact that these acts are seen as immoral because they are outside of the marital act. Sexual
mm,
union can only take place in the marital act. Pope Francis Amoris
mm,
Laetitia makes it very clear that so-called same-sex unions cannot be treated as being on a par with marriage.
mm,
So the Catechism, the Magisterium, Pope Francis,
mm.
all very clear about the morality here, and we can always
Yes.
work on better ways to reach out to
Right.
those who identify in this way. But in doing so,
Mm,
that doesn't call people to repentance. That doesn't call them to the heart's deepest longing beyond sexual orientation. It ultimately leaves people unfulfilled. And I do think that
mm,
many people who are liberal who follow Father Martin, they are pining for they might think I'm going to stick in with being Catholic because one day the church will change, but it won't. And I think they're just
mm,
setting themselves up for a lot of grief.
mm. The question in everyone's mind is, why is Father Martin still a priest? Pope Francis in 2013 excommunicated Father Greg Reynolds of Melbourne, Australia, for supporting women's ordination and the so called same sex marriage. So, why is Father Martin still a priest?
I think because Father Martin has not crossed the red line of saying women should be priests or two men should be able to get married in the Catholic Church. Father Martin, as I note in my book, is very good about speaking ambiguously so that his
Mm,
comments can be read in an orthodox way, even though they can also be read in an unorthodox way. So he covers his tracks very well in not
mm,
espousing a direct conflict with the church's teachings on these issues, instead putting out behaviors and ways of speaking that subtly undermine the teachings.
mm, mm. Uh, I don't know how similar or different it is in the US and in the Philippines, but when it comes to notifying the church authorities about, let's say, priests that sow confusion, how does one initiate the process generally?
It really depends on the person's superior. So
Mm,
if it's a diocesan priest, it really depends on whether the bishop thinks that it is a
mm,
serious matter or not, and that's going to depend
mm,
on each of the bishops. When it's a religious priest like Father Martin,
mm,
then you're going to have to speak with the superior of their religious community, for example.
mm,
So it really depends on who is in charge over that local authority and that person. And
mm,
different clerics have responded well, and others have responded poorly.
mm. And you mentioned flying the pride flag, and you explained it well with the example of the Confederate flags, because as we record this, it's June 1 already here in the
Yeah,
Philippines.
it is.
It's
Yeah,
May 31 there, and there will be Catholic schools that instead of them celebrating the Sacred Heart of Jesus month, they will be celebrating the pride flags. Aside from what you said, what are the reasons why Catholic schools shouldn't fly the pride flag?
because it's confusing. It's
Mm,
confusing because what that flag means when you go to LGBT quote unquote civil rights organizations,
mm,
what they'll say is this flag means that those who identify as LGBT ought to be treated equally. And what that
mm,
means to be treated equally also means you can't say that the behavior is immoral.
mm,
Just like
mm,
you can't say interracial
mm,
marriage is immoral, or you can say it, but you'll suffer consequences for that
mm,
in polite society. And of
mm,
course, and I would say that it's wrong to say that interracial marriage is immoral because there is nothing immoral about interracial marriage
mm,
because race is not a necessary element of marriage or sex. But the presence of various genitalia, the presence of being a man or
mm.
a man or a woman, that is necessary
Yeah.
to the definition of marriage because marriage is not just whatever unites two adults or more
Mm,
than two adults. Marriage is what
mm,
unites men and women to one another and to any children that may proceed from their union. And
mm,
anything beyond that that you call marriage is just disordered and it's a
mm,
counterfeit. So that's important to keep in mind.
mm. If you're having a pride march only because you're an activist against the oppression of uh, people who identify as LGBT, let's say in Islamic countries,
Right.
and that's everything it's all about. It should be fine, but it represents more than that. And and
Right, and you can
y-
choose a different symbol to say when you agree with Pope Francis, for
mm,
example, that homosexual conduct amongst adults should not be given the death penalty. And nobody should be receiving the death
mm,
penalty.
mm,
And you can point that out without using a symbol that is a symbol for evil.
mm,
So, for example, I mean, if there was a country that was uh, that was well if there's a country that is
mm,
committing crimes against Muslims, for example, one could speak out against that
mm,
without flying the star and crescent moon, the symbol of
mm,
Islam. Like a
mm,
Catholic school shouldn't fly the flag that is representative of another world religion, even if you're trying to show solidarity with legitimate injustices being committed against members of that religion.
mm.
So that would be one example there.
Hey, let's shift gears. Let's talk about climate change.
Sure.
And when it comes to Pope Francis, I'm not a critic of the Pope. In fact, I defended him many times. However, I disagree with the Pope's stance on climate change in the two documents that came out.
Right.
So I might butcher this. So it's Laudato Si and Laudate Deum.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
I might interchange the Laudate and Laudato. So,
Yeah,
are we obliged to follow these documents, which has scientific claims,
right.
I think, and it seems to be outside of the Pope's authority, which should be about faith and morals?
Right. Well, when we look at documents that the Pope will use his teaching office as the papal
Mm,
magisterium,
okay.
when you look at different papal documents, there are going to be different elements within them. They don't all have the same levels of authority. So, for
Mm,
example, the Pope can teach infallibly, like when he defines something ex cathedra, as popes recently did with the Immaculate Conception or the Assumption of
uh,
Mary. But of course, that's something rare. The Pope almost
mm,
always speaks non infallibly. But
mm,
also in these papal documents, not everything in them is a teaching of the church. Not everything in them requires a religious submission of mind and will. Sometimes there are going to be non-doctrinal statements. The Pope wants to comment on something pressing in the world today, so he might
uh,
summarize scientific opinion on a matter like climate change. But
yeah.
that's a scientific opinion. That is not something that belongs to the deposit of faith that requires religious submission of mind and will. The Pope may also express a general aspiration, a general goal for
Uh,
society, especially if it's proposed to non-Catholics for them. You know, he's
mm,
offering a proposal for them, and we see these non-doctrinal statements of aspiration in Laudato Si, talking about we must abandon fossil fuels without
mm,
delay. These are interventions in the prudential order that
mm,
do not rise to the level of church teaching. So we're not bound to accept them. We should give them we give them due respect and consider them. But a Catholic could reasonably disagree with them.
mm,
We should agree with the church teaching in these documents that says things that we ought to care for the environment, but we might disagree about the best way to care for the environment.
mm, mm. Yeah. I've read Alex Epstein's book, Fossil Future. I'm
Yes,
convinced of the morality of continuing to use fossil fuels than stopping it. But
well, there's just no
yeah,
viable alternative. When
yeah.
you look around
Mm,
the world, there's
mm,
I think only like 5 countries, a handful of countries that get more than 20% of their energy from wind
mm,
power. And in order to, if you want to be a country that gets a lot of your energy from wind power, you got to have wind. So
mm,
usually these countries are like Uruguay or Ireland. They have a long coastline, so they're able to get a
mm,
lot of coastal breeze to get wind. You have countries like Germany. Germany has wind farms, but a few years ago they had a big wind drought and they had to use more coal because they didn't
mm,
have wind. Solar is similar. There's some countries you can get a lot of sun, but there's a lot of countries where you get cloudy days and a lot of winter. It's hard to get sun out.
mm,
That's why no major country has more than 20% of its power from sun. I think maybe like Nambia has more than
mm,
20%.
mm,
Luxembourg's like 17 or 18%.
mm,
I think the biggest country that has more, the biggest country is Australia. It still is just 14%.
mm,
That to switch over now, what's ironic though, as I point out in the book, I actually do agree with Pope Francis. Climate change is serious. As a world, it would be good to transition from fossil fuels. But
mm,
the best way to do that would be to advance nuclear power. We'd only
mm,
need
mm,
5,000 nuclear power plants to power the entire world,
mm.
or 5,000 more. I think I can't remember which one it was, but not
Mm,
very many. You would need
mm,
billions of
yeah.
solar panels, and we just
Mm,
don't have that. We don't have the battery technology for it. And the thing is though
mm,
that there are poor countries around the world today. They're nowhere near having a nuclear power plant or being able to run everything on solar and wind. If developed countries can't use just
mm,
solar and wind, poor countries can't. But poor countries
mm,
can use much cleaner things, like they
yeah.
burn dung or they burn brown coal. They could burn
Mm,
clean coal or they could burn natural gas. It would be an improvement for the environment, and it would be an improvement for their well-being and their flourishing.
mm. Yeah. So if climate change advocates are sincere with what they're talking about, they would have endorsed nuclear, which is a
Some
really
do,
clean
but the vast
energy.
majority don't, or they treat it as an afterthought. In my debate with Tony Annette, he said
Mm,
nuclear had its place, but he felt like wind and solar is just the
mm,
primary means of the future. And I don't see how it is. Like Tony liked to say, oh, well, solar is cheap. It's the cheapest form of power. Yeah, that's like
mm,
saying it's like renting a trailer is cheaper than renting a car. Yeah, it is, but you can't do anything with just a trailer. The
mm,
same thing, you cannot run an electrical grid just on solar power because guess what? It doesn't work at night. when people need power, and we don't
Yeah.
have battery
Oh, yeah.
technology that can just
Yeah.
store all of that. And it also, solar is at its weakest when demand is highest. Solar is at its weakest when the sun is setting, but that's the time when everybody comes home from work and turns on their air
Mm,
conditioners.
mm.
So it's, yeah,
Yeah. I was in California last year, and I saw a lot of wind wind turbines, windmills, they call it,
yes,
in the
wind
desert.
turbines.
And I I'm not sure how cheap is the electricity in California. I heard
It's very,
Germany's.
it's
Yeah, I
very
heard Germany's.
expensive.
Oh, so it didn't help
No,
with.
I mean, California still taxes it. It's expensive. And also the problem is you have some Catholics who believe climate change is the most pressing issue of our time, want everyone to switch to electric cars, even though electric cars use fossil fuels because they charge from the electric grid.
Mm,
It requires fossil fuels to mine the materials for the batteries. They're
mm,
not actually that clean, and yet people treat them
mm,
in that
yeah.
way. And I think a lot of times people are posturing and want to invest in this issue when there's other issues where we could dramatically help people right now.
Mm, mm. Yep. Hey, I saved the best question for
Sure.
last.
Yeah.
The elephant in the room. Is Pope Francis
Yeah.
liberal? Is he one of the? Is he in the same category as Father James Martin and all?
Pope Francis is sui generis. You know,
Mm,
he's one of a kind, really. It's
mm,
very hard to put in his views to put them down because he'll say things that are very friendly to more liberal elements of society and the church.
mm,
But then the next day he'll say things that those members of the church very much don't like.
mm,
So for example, in the doctrine, the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith spoke about gender ideology. Pope Francis approved this
mm,
in a way that many of them didn't like. And Pope Francis
mm,
has condemned surrogacy. He's condemned transgender identity as part of gender
mm,
colonization. He even spoke very frank with the Italian bishops about those who identify as being homosexual in the priesthood. He was very frank about that, apparently from reported conversations.
recently,
Yeah, recently,
the
yes, in a
yeah.
way that
Mm,
people left on the church aren't as big fans of. So, yeah, I
mm,
don't know. He
mm,
says a lot of different things. I include him a little bit in the book, but it's not a
mm,
major focus because I'm focusing more on the
yeah,
people
yeah,
who are really committed to arguing
yeah.
for this within the church.
Would you have? I read the conclusion of the book, but would you have uh, written it differently had, let's say, Dignitas Infinita came out while you were writing the book?
Oh,
Because
absolutely. I certainly would
mm,
have included it in the
mm,
section on transgender identity.
mm,
Absolutely.
mm,
Part challenge of writing this book is everything comes out right after you're done. I
mm,
barely was able to include Laudate Deum and a few other.
mm,
If you look in the
mm,
end notes, you can find some news stories in there that I added maybe like 3 weeks before publication.
mm, mm. Yeah, I I have defended the Pope in the whole fiducia supplicans
Yeah.
debacle, and never have I been bashed by fellow Catholics
Yeah.
in my podcasting career. And
If anything,
I,
more liberal Catholics were unhappy with the ultimate response to that. It was
I
just too little, too late.
yeah, some were publicly bashing the Pope.
Yeah.
Uh, like I mentioned about your destiny debate, uh, you'll come to a lot of undesirable conclusions if you take a worldview. Let's say for the Pope, if Catholics went too far to saying that the Pope taught heresy, which some say, I think a lot of our evangelization efforts would be undermined if we go
Oh,
that
yeah.
route. Then, let's say when you defend the Pope, not all the time, because sometimes you'd cringe at some of the
No one's perfect. The
yeah
Pope can
yeah
make mistakes.
yeah
Papal infallibility has never been that the Pope can't
mm,
be a bad Pope, just
mm,
that he won't formally teach error in relation to faith
mm,
and morals.
mm,
And if you just say, "Oh, well, the Pope's a heretic, but I just don't listen to him," okay, why
mm,
would anyone want to be Catholic? They could say, "Well, I don't listen to the Pope either, but I'll be Orthodox or I'll be Anglican or some other
mm,
Protestant or whatever. I'll just do what I think is right because you do what you think is right." Like, why be
mm,
Catholic if you're not going to listen to the Pope at all?
yeah. I guess my question is, what's the extent of criticism to the Pope does the document Donum Veritatis allow?
Yeah, it would depend on the level of teaching. So, you can't
Mm,
criticize an infallible teaching that makes you a heretic. If something is presented as requiring religious submission of mind and will, then you cannot publicly critique it,
Mm,
but theologians could offer concerns about it within appropriate venues for theologians to do that. You don't have to privately accept it. You do have to privately accept dogma, things that are dogmatically defined. But religious submission of mind and will, you could fail personally to accept it. You just can't publicly oppose it. And you couldn't engage in it. So, for example, there's no infallible dogmatic teaching on in vitro fertilization.
mm,
So you could personally struggle with that teaching. Just don't publicly oppose it and don't go out and do IVF. So
mhm,
obey it, even if you
mm,
be obedient to the teaching.
mm,
And then, but in affairs of the prudential judgment or of the prudential order, there I would say Catholics can disagree with the Pope, but they ought to do so in a respectful way because he's still the head of the church. He's the successor of St. Peter, and one should approach that kind of criticism with a certain amount of gravitas.
mm. Hey, Trent, thanks for what you do. We're at the end of the show.
Sure.
To the listeners, we only scratch the surface of the book. So there's a lot of topics in your book that we haven't explored.
Sure.
You talked about racism, deportation, abortion, and even some liberal attacks on the Eucharist, the
Yes.
Bible, and many more. So the book is entitled Confusion the Kingdom: How Progressive Catholicism is Bringing Harm and Scandal to the Church. Trent, please invite the audience to your work and your
Oh,
social
of course.
media.
You can check it out at Council of Trent. Just search for Trent Horn on YouTube. You can also go to Catholic Answers at Catholic.com and check out more of my work there.
What's in the pipeline? Debates, a new book.
I got a debate on Mormonism in August,
Mm,
and I'm working on a book on the Catholic view of salvation. So that should come out
mm,
hopefully
mm.
next spring. So lots of good stuff.
Hey, I'd be interested as well on the right wing version of this book you mentioned earlier. When that comes out, please drop by again to the show.
Sure. Happy to do that.
All right. This has been another episode of the J. Aruga Show. At the end of the day, it will be night. Goodbye.